similar orders, the system would become unworkable. India's healthcare system is overwhelmed. Many hospitals repeatedly say oxygen stocks are dangerously low.
China has reassured the world that there's an extremely low risk of harm from one of its rockets, which is expected to plunge to Earth over the weekend. This report from Michael Bristow.
The rocket was used last week to launch part of China's new space station and is currently orbiting the Earth at nearly 30,000 kilometres an hour. But it's slowly losing altitude and will make an uncontrolled re-entry as it was designed to do. A Chinese spokesman said most of the rocket would burn up as it re-enters the atmosphere and there was very little risk of debris hitting someone on the ground. There's been criticism of China for not designing this booster rocket so it would make a more controlled journey back to Earth.
Michael Bristow. You're listening to World News from the BBC. The UN Human Rights Office has called for an independent investigation into a Brazilian police operation in Rio de Janeiro, which resulted in at least 25 deaths. The UN said there was disproportionate use of force and the police had failed to preserve evidence at the crime scene. Several eyewitnesses in the poor neighbourhood of Jacarezinho have said officers killed people who had already surrendered. Reports from the West Bank say Israeli troops have shot dead 2 Palestinians following an attack on an Israeli checkpoint outside Jenin. Here's Tom Bateman.
The bodies of 2 Palestinian men could be seen close to an Israeli police base. It lies in an area between the occupied West Bank and northern Israel. The Israeli army says 3 Palestinians with homemade rifles had opened fire at security forces who responded, killing 2 and wounding 1. There was no comment from Palestinian officials. This week in the West Bank saw a 19-year-old Israeli religious student killed by a Palestinian gunman and a Palestinian boy aged 16 shot dead by Israeli forces during clashes as they mounted a large-scale search for the suspect.
The Afghan capital Kabul has suffered blackouts after 2 electricity pylons were blown up. A third was damaged and a 4th bomb was defused. Afghanistan's power infrastructure, a focus for international funding, is frequently targeted by militant groups. Meanwhile, fierce fighting is continuing between Afghan troops and the Taliban in the northern province of Baghlan. Kenya is for the first time conducting a nationwide wildlife census in a bid to boost conservation efforts. The Kenya Wildlife Service says helicopters will be used to help count and map the distribution of the larger mammals on land, in lakes and on the Indian Ocean coast. BBC News.
天天在一起，天天用心听，听见台北的声音。FM 93.1，幸福永远属于你。
公民总主笔，
方恩格时间。
谁当家？
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 你当家？
谁当家？谁当家？
谁当家？
谁当家？我当
家？
你当家？我当家？
我当家？
到底谁当家？你来当家。
Welcome to Resonance Messenger on Taipei Broadcasting Station. I'm your host, Ross Darrell Feingold. Our guest today is Anthony Carlisle. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me.
Anthony is an advisor to the Garden of Hope Foundation, a non-government organization here in Taiwan that assists women who are victims of sexual violence and sex trafficking, domestic violence. But Anthony, before we talk about your career with non-government organizations here in Taiwan, tell us a little bit about yourself. Which part of the United Kingdom are you originally from?
I usually tell people I'm from London because nobody knows where I come from.
Well, that's what makes it interesting, right? to hear about it.
I was born in Essex, in Chelmsford, and grew up in Braintree. Essex is famous in England for being kind of low class. You get like women with white stilettos, men with too tight jeans.
It sounds like some kind of throwback to the 80s, with like punk rockers.
Yeah, I'm a child of the 80s, so that's where I came from.
But you went to university in Lancaster,
yeah,
which is kind of in the northwest. I'm trying to show off my knowledge of English geography. But Lancaster is a very interesting town because it has such a long history with ruins from the Romans and things like that. Tell us a little bit about Lancaster and going to school there.
Yeah, I wish I could tell you about the history of Lancaster and the interesting ruins that are there, but I was in college, so it was mainly which pubs to go to, which clubs. I got quite good at pool, like billiards, or what do you call it? Yeah, you call it
snooker.
Yeah, I got quite good at that, and it was a great time studying at Lancaster, being away from home for the first time for such a long time, and making friends that I still have today.
And then for graduate school, you went to the other side of England, more in the southeast or closer to London. You went to graduate school in Southampton, which I think maybe more people here in Taiwan might be familiar with, closer to the coast. What was that like, being in a completely different part of England?
Yeah. Well, you find that pretty much wherever you go in England, it's more or less, it's not that different. There's always a Woolworths, there's always a Sainsbury's. It's kind of the same wherever you go. It's not a very big country, but yeah, being in the south, of course, the weather was better. It was nice to be by the sea. I had plans to take up sailing again, but again, I didn't do that. Got more into student politics when I went back to Southampton.
Oh yeah, you want to share which party you were part of? No, I'm kidding. You don't have to do that. But is that something that students in England are quite active in, or does it more attract like a small kind of core group of people who are interested in those activities?
I think it's a very small core group now. I was from the generation where you went to university we were lucky enough to get a grant, and you went there because you wanted to learn and you wanted to expand your mind, and you were very socially aware, and so student politics was a big part of college life. But now it's all about what job you're going to get when you graduate, whether you have to get a grant, you have to pay for tuition, and so it's very different.
When you were in school, kind of late 80s, 90s, one of the issues that was big was the presence of American troops, right? Some European students, they didn't like those Americans with their nuclear weapons to be in parts of Europe. Were you out there protesting?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, like most young British people from those days, you generally had a very negative view of what Americans were like. They're just dumb and they're trying to take over the world. And Ronald Reagan was the president at the time. But now, having got older and having lived in Taiwan for so long, I realized that, maybe there are actually a lot of things that the United States does very well, and we're lucky that the most powerful country in the world happens to be a democracy and cares about human rights and things like that as well.
As an American, I'm certainly gratified to hear that, since we hear so much negativity about the United States in recent years. You just mentioned Taiwan, though, and we were talking about your time at university. Had you heard of Taiwan? What did you know about Asia when you were studying in university?
Yeah, I knew quite a bit about China and generally about the world. I had from my parents, they were seafarers. They both worked on cruise ships. My father also worked for the Merchant Navy. He was an engineer, my mother was a nurse. So they met off the sea in Australia and fell in love and had me. And then my mother came back home, but my father kept traveling. So, did
he come back with gifts from around the world, including Asia?
Yeah, so he always came back with these exotic things that
Give us an example of what your dad brought back from Asia that was exotic for you at the time.
From Asia? I can remember a doll, I think, and some African masks as well, and some things from South America. Mm-hmm. And when we were watching TV, whether it was the Egyptian pyramids or whether it's the Sydney Harbour Bridge, my father would say, "Oh, I've been there." So that gave me the desire to go abroad.
And even though you've spent the bulk of your working career here in Taiwan, when you were younger, you spent some time in Jilin, China. What were you doing there, and what was that like?
Well, the other big influence on my life was my grandfather. He was an expert on Chinese modern history. He was a bit of a communist, like I was, back in my student days. And so he was a fan of the whole communist system. He'd never been there, so that's probably why he was such a fan of it. And but he told me in very vividly and about what China was like, and that excited me about that place. So yeah, when I got the opportunity to go to China through my school, through Lancaster University, I grabbed it and I said, yeah, of course, I'd love to go.
Yeah. And what were you doing there in Jilin?
I was
studying, teaching.
Ostensibly, I went to teach mathematics because it was the mathematics department. I was a mathematics student, so I graduated in math, and I went to China to teach them math. But when I got there, of course, their math was all much better than mine. So I quickly changed to become an English teacher. So I taught English in Jilin and 1 year in Changchun as well. So I was teaching for 2 years in the northeast of China.
Was the air as bad as some people perceive it to be because it's so industrial in that part of China?
Yeah, well, back in those days, well, this is a long time, this is 30 years ago. I was there in 1989, which is the year of the Tiananmen massacre. So things were very different back then. Yeah, it was pretty dirty. It would snow, being the northeast, very, very cold. But then the snow would quickly turn black. But it's nowhere near as bad. The pollution is nowhere near as bad as it is now.
On that kind of discouraging note, you then came to Taiwan.
Yeah.
And you spent some time in southern Taiwan, right? You lived, worked in Kaohsiung.
Yeah.
And what was it like living in Kaohsiung as a foreigner in the early to mid-90s?
Yeah, it was kind of like the Wild West.
Actually, I don't know if people in Kaohsiung would appreciate hearing that.
Well, I don't think they'd be offended. They said themselves that traffic lights were just for reference only. So it was always, when you came to an intersection, it was the light's red, look left, look right, then go. The light's green, stop, look left, look right, then go. So it was always a negotiating process. You didn't have to wear helmets. You didn't have to wear helmets in Taipei back then. But friends of mine told me, I asked around before I went to Taiwan, and friends said, whatever you do, don't go to Taipei. Taipei is not a place you can live. Of course, everything's very different now. Mm-hmm. But back then, the Danshui River was very dirty. The MRT hadn't been built, or it was just being built. Traffic was very congested, and pollution was also a problem. So southern Taiwan seemed to be more attractive at that time.
What were the people like, though, for you when you first came to Taiwan, and especially being not in the big city, in the capital? What were your and you had lived in China already, so what was it like interacting with Taiwanese people in southern Taiwan when you first arrived?
Well, they're very nice and very welcoming, as they are in China as well. I mean, I was welcomed there, and I felt very much at home. But coming to Taiwan, it was even more so. I think the people are very warm. Very curious about foreigners as well, very interested in our opinions, like they were in China too. And so, yeah, it kind of made you feel welcome, a bit special, but always a little bit of, if you wanted to go deeper or say something critical about the country, or get more involved in a grassroots way, it was more. There was always a barrier there.
And yet, you're a rare example, in my experience of living in Taiwan, of a foreigner who has gotten involved in the grassroots, because you've been working in Taiwan's NGO sector for many years, and it's somewhat unusual to meet a foreigner who's worked for nonprofit organizations in Taiwan. Give us an overview of the nonprofit sector scene in Taiwan.
Yeah, well, there are a few of us. There are a few foreigners who are working in NGOs here. I'm not the only one. But yeah, I feel very privileged to be able to do this. I've been lucky that I've got into the right organizations, and I've been able to stay in the nonprofit sector for over 20 years now in Taiwan. Yeah, so it's a very big sector. There are lots of NGOs, but most of them are very small. The ones doing international work maybe number around 3,000 or so, and they're active to different extents as well. So you can see that after the martial law was lifted in Taiwan, there was really an explosion in the civil society sector. So most of the NGOs you look at in Taiwan are around 30, 40 years old, because they came up from that era, like the Garden of Hope. Garden of Hope's a 30 plus years old NGO. So they came up with the rise of the democracy movement in Taiwan, and they've grown and developed with society as the democracy in Taiwan has grown and become more solid and more mature. Then you can see that the civil society sector is growing and becoming more mature as well. And also, I'm happy to say that recently there have been a lot of new NGOs that have been started up by young people, doing interesting things, whether it's working with open source software or working on other issues of overseas volunteering or social enterprise or other new fields.
From a management perspective, of an NGO management perspective, or achieving the mission, what are some things that Taiwan NGOs do really well?
I think they connect with people really well. They're able to reach to communities and provide that human touch that perhaps government or other larger institutions aren't able to do. They're also able to, because there are so many of them and they're so small, they're very diverse. So they're able to cover a lot of bases and cover a lot of fields. And they're also very passionate. So the people I knew who were working for NGOs back 20 years ago are still people who are working for NGOs today. Once you become an NGO worker, it seems that you're always an NGO worker.
How do these many NGOs maintain a profile? It's a crowded marketplace, as you said, because there's so many.
Yeah.
How do they keep the public aware of who they are or distinguish from similar NGOs? I mean, NGOs might be working on domestic violence, as Garden of Hope is, or environmental issues, but then they're more focused on, might be looking at different parts or different aspects of environmental issues. Is it just a question of having good websites and Facebook pages, or people on the street soliciting money? How do they distinguish themselves?
Yeah, the ones that can use the media, I think, are successful. But there is certainly a gap between the different stratas of NGOs in Taiwan by size and influence. So at the very top you have the huge Tzu Chi organization. So they're the biggest one. And then tier 2 you have these NGOs of around 500 to 1,000 staff, like the Garden of Hope, like the Eden Foundation, like World Vision, like CCF, the Chinese Children's Foundation. So these are in the second tier, and they're very visible, and most people know them, and they trust them to donate to them, and so on. And then you have then there's a big gap, and so the ones below that will maybe have 20 staff or 30 staff or so, and so it's much more difficult for those NGOs to find their place, to get funds, and to make their voices heard. So it can be frustrating for those NGOs that are in the third tier.
What about the perception that you sometimes hear about NGOs, very similar to some religious organizations, really being a vehicle for a small number of people who control it to donate money or to collect money that they then spend on activities that make them famous? Is that a problem with NGOs as well?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and not just in Taiwan as well. You see this phenomena in other countries as well. There's a name, I think, called Mingo. Mingo is my NGO. So it's just an NGO that's owned by you, and you use it for your own personal purposes and to push your own particular agenda. You also see it in the corporate sector as well. So corporations might have their own foundation, but it's just there as a show for the corporation to do marketing or tell the public to try and persuade the public that it's doing something for charity and for society. So it's a problem in Taiwan, but it's not exclusively a problem for Taiwan.
And the public, what's their interest and their willingness to donate or to volunteer their time, and how does it compare to other places as well?
Oh, I used to know the figures about that. It's not as high as the US, but not too bad. Volunteering in Taiwan is quite high, whether it's working for soup kitchens or with, of course, again, it comes back to the Tzu Chi organization. They have thousands of volunteers. But other organizations like the Eden Foundation, or there's an organization that I used to work for called IAVI, the International Association for Volunteer Effort. They also have a lot of volunteers working for them, or VIA, Volunteer Youth Action in Taiwan. They organize volunteer programs for young people. So yeah, it's a growing field.
Is there an issue that seems to attract more volunteers in Taiwan than others, such as, for example, disaster relief, because there's typhoons and periodically earthquakes, and you mentioned Tzu Chi, or they're really quick to be on the scene when there's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, or environmental, because they seem to be in the media a lot, environmental focused. NGOs, are there some specific issues that seem to attract more volunteers? And then are there some issues where NGOs involved in that area struggle to get volunteers?
Yeah, well, volunteering with NGOs, it can be a controversial area because the activities that are popular with volunteers tend to be very labor intensive. So you mentioned the environment. So cleaning up a beach is an example. It's quite easy. You need hundreds of people and you can see an immediate effect. It's safe. Nobody's going to get hurt, hopefully. But on the other hand, if you want to volunteer for an organization like the Garden of Hope, working with survivors of sexual abuse, working within a shelter that might be in a secret location, then things become much more complicated. So it's difficult for organizations like the Garden of Hope to first recruit volunteers and secondly organize meaningful activities that aren't going to put them at risk or put the Garden of Hope's clients at risk, but at the same time are going to do some good. And on the other hand, these big volunteer or high labor intensive volunteer like cleaning a beach, many environmental groups will ask, well, is this really getting to the core of the problem? I mean, shouldn't we be looking at where this waste is coming from? Shouldn't we be stopping it at the source rather than cleaning it up where it's already been washed in from the ocean and done goodness knows how much damage already?
The criticism I've heard about the beach cleanup, and you mentioned the corporate affiliated NGOs, is the chairman will show up at the beach cleanup day that all the employees have been bussed over to the beach. The chairman will pick up one piece of garbage, take a photo, and then get back in his fancy car and leave. And the rest of the employees are left to keep doing some cleanup for a few hours, but it sort of loses its significance. But generally speaking, we'll try to be fair to the corporate world. Are they a good supporter for NGOs in Taiwan? Do they make available a sufficient amount of resources, not just financial, but other resources as well? Do they let staff give their time? Do they encourage staff to give their time to volunteer activities?
Yeah, for sure. Although there's a big gap between international corporations in Taiwan and local Taiwanese companies.
Can you give us an example? Do you mean an international company is more likely to allow an employee to take 10 hours every year to do volunteering, but a local company might be more reluctant to approve such a time investment?
Yeah. It's part of the corporate culture with international companies. So for an organization like Citibank have their volunteer day where all the employees have to go out and I don't know if they have to, but they're strongly encouraged to go out and then do some act of volunteering, and it's a big part of their CSR work and their corporate culture. So when you're part of the Citibank family, then that's part of what you do. But working for a Taiwanese bank, it's not necessarily part of the culture yet. So that's something that. So most of the corporate partners we had at the Garden of Hope were big international companies like HSBC or Citi, but there were some Taiwanese companies as well, like the Curves fitness gym for women. They're a very strong supporter of the Garden of Hope. So things are changing, but there's more that certainly big local corporations could do. Smaller companies is very difficult because they already have skeleton staff, and it's hard to give them 1 day off or 10 days off to do volunteer work. But for bigger companies, I think they certainly could be doing more.
And how could you change that? You know, as somebody who works with an NGO, I mean, when you go meet with a prominent local company and talk to them about encouraging staff and being more willing to put other types of resources into NGO work, how do you persuade them to come on board?
I think you have to start from the top. So the CEO has to be on board. And though even though he goes to the beach and just picks up one piece of garbage and then goes home, at least he does that. And so he's behind that initiative, or she, of course. And secondly, it has to be part of the corporate structure. So that would usually be the HR department. They would have to take a lead on that, and they would make it part of their staff growth and training would be to do volunteer work or to do some kind of donation or one-on-one giving. So the employee gives $1 and then the company gives $1 as a one-on-one agreement.
Okay. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to talk some more about the NGO sector in Taiwan, and specifically about the Garden of Hope Foundation and its work that it does with assisting women who are victims of domestic violence and sexual trafficking. You're listening to Resonance Messenger on Taipei Broadcasting Station.
如有长照服务需求、长照特别扣除额问题，请拨打1966长照专线，5分钟内通话免付费。一通电话让长期照顾管理专员协助申请长期照顾服务及解答长期照顾特别扣除额相关问题。以上内容由台北市政府卫生局提供。
爸爸应酬不开车，黄色嘟嘟安全多，应酬喝酒不过量，安全回家最上道。爸爸要平安回家哦。
喝酒不开车，开车不喝酒哦。让我们一起尊重生命，拥抱亲情。
亲爱的民众，提醒您定期清除排油烟机内部油垢。烹煮食物时，切忌分心做其他事情，并注意人离火熄。且厨房附近应设置灭火器，操作时保持适当距离。当厨房火灾时，严禁以水灭火。油锅起火也千万不要移动油锅，以免翻覆造成火势扩大延烧。以上内容由台北市政府消防局提供。
亲爱的朋友，您还在吸烟吗？快拿着健保卡到戒烟门诊或拨打戒烟专线0800636363。提醒您，最近兴起的电子烟、加热烟，因为没有浓浓的烟臭味，就被认为无害。其实已经证实，新兴烟品都有二手烟及三手烟的危害，甚至还有爆炸的风险。我是义工蔡依林，所有烟品都 get out。我拒烟，我骄傲。
我是疾管署防疫师陈婉清。防疫期间，如果您是正在居家隔离或检疫的民众，请留在家中或隔离检疫场所，不可随意外出。若您在隔离检疫期间出现发烧、嗅味觉异常、腹泻、呼吸道症状或身体不适，请佩戴口罩，联系卫生局或1922，并依指示就医，不可自行搭乘大众运输。如果您有洗牙、健检等非紧急医疗需求，请先暂缓延后。
有政府，请安心。资讯由疾管署提供。
家己电台家己主持咧。大家好，我是郭文铁，我伫台北广播电台。
谁当家？
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 你当家？
谁当家？谁当家？
谁当家？
谁当家？我当家。你当家？我当家。
我当家。
到底谁当家？你来当家。
Welcome back to Residence Messenger. Our guest today is Anthony Carlisle, an advisor to the Garden of Hope Foundation, one of the more prominent non-government organizations here in Taiwan, which is involved in helping women who are victims of domestic violence and sexual trafficking. Anthony, before we talk in more detail about Garden of Hope, we were talking about other stakeholders before the break, such as the corporate world and the public more broadly. But what about the government? Is the central government or city governments and county governments here in Taiwan, are they a good partner to NGOs?
Generally, yes. Of course, from my perspective anyway, of course, the people you talk to in NGOs would say no. But
is that simply because of a lack of financial support, that people in the NGO sector feel the government should give more money, or are there other issues as well, separate from funding?
Yeah, it's a complicated relationship between government and NGOs in Taiwan. When I mentioned before the break about the rapid rise in NGOs in the 80s, and then the government at that time was quite weak, and it was after the 9/21 earthquake, and then there were a lot of weaknesses in the government came to the surface through that, and NGOs really took to the cause very quickly and did things more quickly and better than the government, and so government started to put out a lot of contracts, give a lot of contracts to NGOs to run these essential services like the Garden of Hope and the shelters and so on. And now NGOs are kind of become subcontractors to the government in many ways. And now they're struggling to keep their independence because half their funding or more in some cases might come from the government. Of course, they don't feel that means that they can't criticize the government at all, but it can be a tricky relationship. But coming from a Western European perspective, or if you look at other countries in the world that are radically opposed to NGOs and will not, it's not about not giving them funding, it's about putting them in jail and so on. So I feel that generally the relationship between the government and NGOs in Taiwan is quite good.
And what about the trend for oversight by governments, whether again at the municipal, county level or the central government level? Is it correct where we are now, or is there a push by legislators or the central government to exercise greater oversight or too much oversight over the day-to-day operations of NGOs?
Yeah, that's a bane in the back of NGOs in Taiwan. They have to do these annual or sometimes biannual assessments, where the governments will come in and they'll check that this is if they have big government contracts, and the government will come in and they'll check that they're providing the proper services, and they'll try and pick holes in it and maybe even try and cut their funding. So that's and there's a lot of bureaucracy with that as well. So the NGOs will have to prepare a lot of paperwork, and it can be a big headache for an NGO that's going through an assessment. Otherwise, they more or less let NGOs do what they want. There are some rules. Initially, the rules are quite complicated about setting up a foundation or an association, but once you're up and running, there's not much that the government can do to, if you're not getting any money from them, there's not much they can do to oversee your work. In theory, you should present an annual report to the Ministry of the Interior or whatever government department you're under. But in practice, if you don't do that, you can still keep working.
Earlier in the show, you referred to the women who access the Garden of Hope services as clients.
Yeah.
Why are they considered clients?
We try to use vocabulary that doesn't make it a power relationship between a victim and a helper, or someone who's disabled and someone who's giving services. Of course, these people need help, but we don't think that the fact that they suffered violence defines who they are. And secondly, while they're in a shelter or while they're receiving services from the Garden of Hope, we view that as an equal relationship. So we're working together with the client to solve their problems. So it's a mutual process.
In addition to shelters, what are some of the other programs that the Garden of Hope runs on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, we have post-shelter services. So after women who suffered violence leave the shelter, the pressure is on them then to go back to their husband or their abuser and get back into that cycle of violence, whether it's through economic pressure or social pressures or other reasons. So the post-shelter services provided by the Garden of Hope include employment services, helping leverage women to get into the job place, provide training, helping them write resumes, and even we have some workplaces where they can work within the Garden of Hope organization in a sheltered environment. We also have a housing program helping connect them with resources to provide semi-independent housing or housing at very low rent. And we also do a lot of advocacy work around the issue of gender equality and ending violence against women.
What are some of the successful initiatives you've had with the gender equality or ending violence against women as far as, say, legal changes or things of that nature? Can you share with us some significant successes that the Garden of Hope has had?
Yeah, at the very start of the Garden of Hope, when they were founded back in 1980, I don't remember the year now, 1988. When they were founded back in 1988, they were set up as a halfway house, a rescue organization to take young girls who've been trafficked into the red light district in Taipei. And then that developed into a protest organization, advocacy organization to stop child prostitution. And that resulted in a successful campaign with the passing of the Anti-Child Prostitution Act in Taiwan, which was later amended to become the Prevention of Child Sexual Exploitation Act. So that encompasses other acts of exploitation that might not involve a financial transaction. And that was passed in 1995. And after that, then a whole raft of different legislation from the Sexual Assault Prevention Act, the Domestic Violence Prevention Act, and the Gender Equality in Education, Gender Equality in Employment, and the Sexual Harassment Prevention Act were passed within 10, 15 years of that. Garden of Hope was involved in many of those, but the baby was really the Anti-Child Prostitution Act.
For those various issues that you just mentioned, taking into account these strengthened laws that have been passed over the years and the work of NGOs such as the Garden of Hope, is it accurate to say the situation has improved as far as the number of women who are victims of domestic violence or sexual trafficking, or the number of children who are exploited?
Yeah, often you find that when a law is introduced and services are provided, the numbers actually go up. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just showing that more people who are coming forward because there's help available for them. So we shouldn't be discouraged when we see more people reporting sexual harassment in the workplace, because that means that the environment is becoming safer and more open for them to come out and talk about issues that maybe they wouldn't report a year or two ago. But yes, I would say that thanks to the efforts of the Garden of Hope and many other women's NGOs in Taiwan as well, and many other civil servants who are working on these issues too within the government, yes, the situation has definitely improved. And you can see that Taiwan is the #1 country in terms of gender equality in Asia. I think we have some of the best services for prevention of domestic violence in Asia as well, perhaps even the world. And it's an example for other countries, certainly within the Asian region and maybe even the world.
One of the rankings that Taiwan often likes to talk about, the Taiwan government, is the U.S. government's human trafficking report, where Taiwan is ranked very well. Is that an accurate picture of the situation in Taiwan?
No. Well, yes and no. For the last 10 years, Taiwan has got the Tier 1 rating on the TIP report, which is great. But Tier 1 means that you pass the minimum standard. So it's a C grade. And of course, the Taiwanese government will say, well, we're doing a great job, which they are. You know, they have the architecture is all there. You have the Human Trafficking Prevention Act. You have regular reviews. The immigration department in the government, they work, NIA, they work very hard on this issue. Local governments work very hard as well. But if you actually read the small print in the TIP report, it will point out lots of things where Taiwan is not doing so well. For example, in the seafaring issue of Taiwanese flagged boats, often foreign flagged boats, but run by Taiwanese companies, the situation on those boats for trafficked seafarers is terrible, and the Taiwanese government is not doing enough, and that's written in the TIP report. The situation for migrant workers in Taiwan as well is not good enough. Many of them are living in their employers' homes. They have no time off work. They're very, very, very vulnerable to exploitation and sexual harassment. So these are issues which if you read the small print in the TIP report, it does point these problems out. But because Taiwan meets the basic standards, then they have the Tier 1. So there's a lot more, and the issue of domestic violence and sexual assault as well in Taiwan. There's much more that we can do, but generally, Taiwan is not such a bad place.
For the issues that the Garden of Hope works on and provides services to clients, is the situation or the demand greater in Taipei? And I don't mean because population is larger, but are these urban issues, or actually Taipei doesn't have as serious a problem as other parts of Taiwan. Help us understand that dynamic.
Yeah, the situation in Taipei is pretty good. You can see from the reports, again, I don't have the exact numbers, but if you see from the reports of domestic violence in Taipei City, they've leveled off for the last 5 or 6 years or so. So there was an initial rise from the passing of the act, and then from other big media stories that always creates a spike. But since then, the number has leveled off, and that's a good sign. That shows that we're pretty much the police and the authorities are reaching out to the people who need help. Taipei City also has a very good women and children's police department, so they do a very good job. Of course, Taipei being the capital city, the welfare resources here, being richer than other cities in Taiwan, they're more abundant. So the quality and the availability of services is better in Taipei than other places in Taiwan.
You've spent a lot of time doing international liaison work on behalf of the Taiwan NGOs that you've worked with, including Garden of Hope. Tell us some successes for Taiwan NGOs in internationally engaging with other NGOs, or because we hear so often how difficult it is, especially on an official level, for Taiwan to participate, especially in anything affiliated with the United Nations. But tell us some good news, some successes for Taiwan NGOs internationally.
Yeah, well, while I was working at the Garden of Hope, we got very involved with the global... I'm an advisor to the Garden of Hope now. I'm not actually employed by them anymore. But while I was working for them, and now as well, we got very involved with the global network of women's shelters. So through that organization, we were able to share the good work that Taiwan's women's shelters were doing with other countries, and also learn from other places like the Netherlands, where they also have a very good system. And through those contacts, in 2019, we hosted the World Conference of Women's Shelters in Kaohsiung City in Taiwan. So that was a great event, and it brought over 1,500 women from all over the world, activists from shelter organizations and other organizations working on issues of gender-based violence to Taiwan, so they could visit the country, and then they could learn from each other and network with each other and be empowered. So that was a success. There's a good platform organization called Taiwan Aid, and they're a networking organization of NGOs in Taiwan that do international work. So whether it's the Eden Foundation, the Garden of Hope is also a member, and you also have some smaller NGOs like the Zhishan Foundation, and they're all doing wonderful work within Southeast Asia, whether it's programs in Vietnam or in Cambodia, or some of them have projects in China as well, or even in Latin American countries. So there's lots going on.
Is there a China issue when Taiwan NGOs try to participate in international forums? Does that same pressure exist? Does the Chinese delegation say they can't be called Taiwan, call them Chinese Taipei, don't show the ROC flag and things like that? Does that come up in the NGO world as well?
Yes, all the time. Yeah, many of my friends in the civil society sector are struggling with those issues, especially if you get involved with the UN, or if the NGO that you're trying to partner with receives a lot of its funding from the United Nations or one of its affiliate bodies. Then it can be the situation can be awkward. I've been thrown out of meetings before.
Literally thrown out.
Yes.
And the basis for being thrown out was
for working for a Taiwanese NGO. But then I was invited back in, but my status was changed to a Japanese NGO.
Oh, how unfortunate.
Yes, it was. It was very traumatic.
We only have a couple of minutes left, Anthony. Anything else you want to share with us about NGO sector in Taiwan, or the Garden of Hope specifically, or programs they have upcoming?
Yeah, we have the Garden of Hope has a couple of webinars coming up. Of course, everything's online now. So check the Garden of Hope's website. There's a webinar coming up in August on the issue of social housing, and then we have another one in November on developmental social work, and these will be in English as well, so you're welcome to log on to them. And also I would encourage people to support the Garden of Hope. We have some opportunities for internships, so there are some international students in Taipei who work at the headquarters, so that's a possibility. And of course we could always do with funding, although we're in that second tier of NGOs. Being a large NGO, we also have large overheads, and so we always need fundraising opportunities. So if you come up with a smart idea to raise money, or if you just want to make a donation, then you would be very grateful if you could do that.
Well, thank you very much. Our guest today has been Anthony Carlisle, advisor to the Garden of Hope Foundation. Anthony, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Residence Messenger on Taipei Broadcasting Station.